As we wait for the former president to begin speaking, we're joined by Chief Washington correspondent Major Garrett, who's there in Bedminster. Major, you've been waiting for this event all day. Tell us about the crowd and what we can anticipate.
About 300 or so, that's a rough estimate, Ed, of invited guests, donors, and members of Trump National Club here in Bedminster. President's about to talk. Let's at least listen.
And heinous abuse of power in the history of our country. Very sad thing to watch. A corrupt sitting president had his top political opponent arrested on fake and fabricated charges of which he and numerous other presidents would be guilty. Right in the middle of a presidential election in which he is losing very badly. This is called election interference and yet another attempt to rig and steal a presidential election. More importantly, it's a political persecution like something straight out of a fascist or a communist nation. This day will go down in infamy, and Joe Biden will forever be remembered as not only the most corrupt president in the history of our country, but perhaps even more importantly, the president who, together with a band of his closest thugs, misfits, and Marxists, tried to destroy American democracy. But they will fail, and we will win bigger and better than ever before. Charging a former president of the United States under the Espionage Act of 1917 wasn't meant for this. An act for a crime so heinous that only the death penalty would do, and threatening me with 400 years in prison for possessing my own presidential papers, which just about every other president has done, is one of the most outrageous and vicious legal theories ever put forward in an American court of law. The Espionage Act has been used to go after traitors and spies. It has nothing to do with a former president legally keeping his own documents. As president, the law that applies to this case is not the Espionage Act, but very simply the Presidential Records Act, which is not even mentioned in this ridiculous 44-page indictment. Under the Presidential Records Act, which is civil, not criminal, I had every right to have these documents. The crucial legal precedent is laid out in the most important case ever on this subject, known as the Clinton Socks case.
So, from the word go there, the former president expressing his displeasure, his anger at today's indictment and his appearance in a Miami federal court, incorrectly alleging that the current president is using the Justice Department to prosecute his opponent. It is a Justice Department that has been operating independent of the White House that brought these charges. Yes, some of them having to do with the Espionage Act. We'll continue to monitor what the former president is saying there at his golf club at Bedminster, New Jersey. But let's bring in Scott MacFarlane and Fin Gómez, who remain in Miami. Scott, of course, is CBS News congressional correspondent. Fin is our political director. Scott, let me turn to you first, because he's been throwing around there the description of the charges, some of them related to the Espionage Act, he claiming that they don't have anything to do with the Presidential Records Act, which is a completely different matter. Remind us, there are 37 counts. They have to do primarily with how he handled, allegedly, this material once he was not in office, right?
These are obstruction, conspiracy charges, concealing government records during a federal investigation. He's articulating some form of defense, legal defense right now from the podium, which I think in many traditional cases, Ed, would give defense attorneys heartburn, if not a heart attack, to hear their client saying such things just hours after being criminally arraigned. He made a reference in just those first few moments to these being his papers, and he's being prosecuted for handling his papers. The indictment is unambiguous. These are the federal government's papers, not any one person's, not a former president. So he's already running against the tide of the charges themselves. He's speaking about the case. This is just what happened a few weeks ago when he spoke the night after he had his initial appearance in Manhattan, where he started saying things about the case, about the arguments, and that is something most criminal defendants are very strongly urged not to do.
In part because he's trying to make a political argument in the public space that will not hold up in a legal space inside that courtroom, where there will be no cameras, where there will be no photographs, where he can't dominate the space and try to control the conversation. So he's doing his best to whip up supporters, get them angry as he is, and mislead the general public on the details of the charges facing him. We should point out, by the way, that this event tonight is billed by the Trump campaign as an appearance first and a fundraiser after. Fin Gómez, who's also there in Miami, you were telling us earlier tonight the goal is to raise $2 million over the course of today. We'll see if they can hit that tonight, if not more. I'm sure they'll come out and tell us tomorrow that they've met or exceeded that. Whether or not they have, we'll see. But what we just saw there, that flash of anger at the beginning, is emblematic of what your reporting has reflected, that he has been hunkering down with his closest aides, believing that he's being wrongfully targeted by his political opponents.
Yeah, one word that I kept hearing yesterday and today from campaign officials is defiant. And that's what I think we're hearing now. We saw a defiant former president throughout the day here in Miami behind me in this courthouse. We saw him with his arms crossed during the proceedings in those sketches that we saw. And I think this is finally a venting, if you will, a geyser almost of frustration that he's finally allowed to speak. But he's also trying to turn the tables. He's trying to focus and target President Biden, who he sees as his chief rival. But he's also trying to foment that and channel that frustration he thinks is emanating from the Republican base towards Biden as well. The fact of the matter is that, this is and has become, it's a political event. He's, as you mentioned, he's talking to some of his core supporters, from Mike Lindell to some of his early supporters in his administration. But he's also trying to talk to that Fox News, that Newsmax crowd as well, who are watching and listening to the former president's words here. But I do want to mention something real quick, Ed, and that is that, we have been hearing this, amounts to like a murmur from his chief Republican primary rivals, but that's become essentially a drumbeat. Mike Pence just a little while ago today met with the Wall Street Journal editorial board, and in that discussion with the editorial board, Trump's former president said, again, called these charges serious and really sharpened his criticism towards his former running mate. So I think you're seeing more of that. You're seeing that steady drumbeat from his rivals, from a timid one to a more vocal one. Nikki Haley just a couple of days ago, Tim Scott tweaking him a little more, and of course Chris Christie, who came out in full force yesterday during a CNN town hall. That's right. So we've now seen 3 or 4 of his opponents start to express a little more concern, at least with the content of the indictment and the charges against him. We're going to get into this more at the top of the hour. We'll continue to monitor what the former president is saying there at his golf resort in New Jersey. We'll be back momentarily with America Decides. Stay with us. You're streaming CBS News.